So we use inductive reasoning when we can't observe all members of a group. So instead, we observe a subset of that group, and then we infer that what is true of the subset is true of the group as a whole. But sometimes we can't observe any members of a group. What do we do then? Well, one thing that we can do is that we can look for something that is similar to the thing that we want to observe and observe that instead. This is called analogical reasoning or argument by analogy. Scientists use analogical reasoning whenever they test things on animals that are intended to be used on people, or they're interested in the effects of something on people, but they aren't allowed to test this stuff on people, so they test it on animals instead. Here's an example. Rabbit eyes are similar to human eyes. This cosmetic is not harmful to rabbit eyes. Therefore, this cosmetic is not harmful to human eyes. The researchers could use their cosmetics on people, but that would be illegal. So they try to find subjects that are similar enough to humans that they can reasonably assume that what is true of one will be true of the other. In this case, the cosmetic companies that torture rabbits, the cosmetic companies that use rabbits in their research have good reason to believe that rabbit eyes are very similar to human eyes, and that's why they use them for the tests. I assume that they have good reason. Maybe they just have something against rabbits. Anyway, the strength of an argument by analogy, whether or not you should accept it, rests upon how similar the two things being compared actually are. If they are mostly similar in relevant respects, then you should probably accept the argument. On the other hand, if they're different in relevant respects, then you probably shouldn't accept the argument. But it's important to keep in mind that what we're interested in here is relevant respects. We're comparing the two things in relevant ways. So in this example, it wouldn't really matter that rabbit eyes are a lot smaller than human eyes, because what we're interested in is whether or not the cosmetic is going to harm them. But it all depends on what we want to infer, what we're interested in determining. To take another example, if you give 100 milligrams of THC per day to rats for a month and they get sick, that doesn't mean that giving 100 milligrams of THC to a person every day is too much. That doesn't mean that 100 milligrams of THC per day is a dangerous amount for humans. Why is that? Why can't we infer that in this case? Anybody? How about you? Yes, that's right. Humans weigh about 300 times as much as rats. So giving 100 milligrams of THC to 100 milligrams of THC to a rat is a lot. An equivalent amount being given to a human would be 300 times that. So 100 milligrams of THC may have an effect on rats, but you can't infer that it's going to have the same effect on humans because humans are much bigger. So as you can see, in this case, the difference in size does matter. You can find analogical reasoning in a lot of different contexts, not just scientific research. Here's another example. I'll read it out. Wolves live in packs, and each pack has a leader called the alpha wolf. Wolves compete for this role, so the alpha wolf must constantly assert his dominance or lose control of the pack. Dogs are basically domesticated wolves, and to your dog, your family is the pack. So if you want a well-behaved dog, you need to show him who's boss, and keep showing him. This is an argument that is used in support of a particular style or method of training for dogs. I've sort of summarized the whole thing into a short argument here. I hope you get the idea. In our first example, we have the argument broken down into two premises and a conclusion, right? Premise, premise, conclusion. If in an argument from analogy, one of the premises says the two things are similar, and the second premise says that something is true of one of those two things, but it isn't true of one of those things, well, in that case, you have an argument with two premises, and one of the premises is false. So if an argument has two premises and one of them is false, chances are it's not going to be a very good argument. And that's true not just of analogy kind of arguments, but of almost every type of argument. I say almost because there is one exception, which we're going to discuss at a future time. But in almost all cases, if you're going to accept an argument, if you're going to be persuaded by an argument, if you're going to evaluate it as a good argument, then you should be confident that all of the premises are true or at least acceptable. Now, I prefer the language of acceptable rather than true because there are a lot of things that can't really be proven, but we still accept them as true. For example, we can't prove that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, but everybody accepts that it will. Likewise, some kinds of claims aren't strictly true or false, but we accept them anyway because everybody, or nearly everybody, agrees. For example, murder is wrong. Is it a fact that murder is wrong? Is that the sort of thing that could even be a fact? It's not something that you could, it's certainly not something that you could show to be true through observation. Nevertheless, it is a claim that we would accept because just about everybody agrees that murder is wrong. And if somebody doesn't agree that murder is wrong, there's probably something wrong with their brain. So this is why I prefer the language of asking whether a premise is acceptable rather than asking whether a premise is true. If we decide a premise is acceptable, it means we're going to treat it as if it were true. It's not acceptable in the sense of I'm okay with that. It's acceptable in the sense that I'm willing to believe that, or I'm willing to grant that that's true, something like that. Anyway, how do you know when a premise is acceptable? I'm going to remind you, premise is another word for reason. We accept a premise when it's common knowledge or otherwise non-debatable. There are certain things that are not necessarily common knowledge, but you wouldn't debate them. For example, subjective claims. If I say to you, I'm hungry, that's not common knowledge, but it's also, you're also not going to argue with me. You're not going to try to prove to me that I'm not hungry. We also accept a premise if the premise is supported by evidence or reasons that we accept, which is a way of saying we'll accept a premise if we're given an argument in support of that premise, and the argument in support of it has premises that are themselves acceptable. Finally, we accept a premise when it's backed up by a citation from an authoritative source. We've talked about citations a few times in the examples that we've gone through, and in the future, I'm going to talk to you about how to tell the difference between authoritative sources and sources that are not authoritative. as I was saying, I prefer the language of asking whether premises are acceptable instead of asking whether they're true, because some claims aren't about facts at all. Here are some examples. Here are some examples of claims, but they're not claims about facts, at least not in the sense that they're about things that can be observed. A sports team using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe is a case of cultural appropriation. Second example, love is the most spiritual of emotions. 3, cannabis is non-addictive, so you don't need to worry about getting hooked. Okay, these are 3 examples of a certain kind of claim or argument, which is called a definitional or a conceptual claim. It's a definitional or conceptual claim because, let me ask you, what do these 3 claims have in common? A sports team using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe is a case of cultural appropriation. Love is the most spiritual of emotions. And cannabis is non-addictive, so you don't need to worry about getting hooked. These are 3 different claims about different things. What they have in common is that in each case, they probably make you want to say, well, that depends on what you mean by cultural appropriation, or that depends on what you mean by spiritual, or that depends on what you mean by addictive. So you recognize a conceptual claim because that claim is a claim that makes you want to go, well, that depends on what you mean by insert word here. What's interesting about conceptual claims is that they can't really be verified in the sense of deciding whether or not they're true or whether or not you're going to accept them. They can't really be verified by observation. I mean, observations may be relevant. For example, there might be observations that you would want to make in judging whether or not cannabis is addictive. But before you can make those observations, you first have to clarify what you mean by the word addictive. Otherwise, you don't know which observations are going to be relevant and which aren't. So a conceptual claim is a claim whose truth depends importantly upon the meaning of words, usually words whose meaning is not clear or there isn't widespread agreement on what those words mean or what counts as examples of those words. There are claims which are based on the meaning of words, but we don't treat them as conceptual claims because they're trivial or non-controversial. Like a claim that we might speak of a claim that's true by definition, and normally when we say that, it's a claim where the definition of a term is already universally agreed upon and there's no confusion. Here are a few examples. Cats are animals. So this is saying that cats, like the class of cats, fits into the wider category of animals. Cats fit under the umbrella of animals. And we've just decided to use the word that way and we've all agreed. So it's true by definition. It's technically a conceptual claim, but there's no need, but you wouldn't really analyze it as a conceptual claim. You would just accept it. Trout are edible to humans. As you can see, none of the words here are, there's no question about what any of the words mean. Next example, a foot is 12 inches. Why is a foot 12 inches? Because these are units of measurement, they're arbitrary, that's how we've defined them. More importantly, there's no ambiguity here. Nobody's going to question, well, what do you mean by a foot? A bachelor is a man who is not married. This is true by definition because a man who is not married is simply what the word bachelor means. So again, it's a claim that depends upon the meaning of words, but because there's no ambiguity or disagreement or vagueness or confusion, we don't treat it as a conceptual claim, we just accept it. Basically, a conceptual or definitional claim normally will contain two concepts, and the claim that's being made will be that one of those things is a kind or subcategory of the other of those things, or the claim will be, here's a thing and it has a characteristic, and the characteristic is a second concept. That will probably be easier to explain if we just look at the examples. Sports team using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe is a case of cultural appropriation. Okay, so what this claim is saying is one kind of thing, a sports team that uses the name or iconography of a Native American tribe. One kind of thing, it's one concept. Concept can be more than one word, by the way. Sports team is more than one word. And in this case, you could argue that the claim is a sports team using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words. Anyway, concepts are usually one word, but they can be two or more words. But they're like one unit of thought. They're like one thing. A sports team using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe is 10 words, but it's obviously not 10 different things. It's one thing. Anyway, so this claim is saying that this one thing, the sports team using the iconography, belongs in the larger category of things that are cultural appropriation. Okay, so it's a case of the first thing is a kind of the second thing, a kind or a category of, or a species of the second thing. Love is the most spiritual of emotions. Love is the most spiritual of emotions. Okay, I don't think that this is a case of placing one concept under the category of another concept. I think this is a case of attributing a feature to a concept. So basically, our one concept is love, and our other concept is spiritual, and spiritual is the concept of spiritual is being used to describe the concept of love, or what the claim is saying is that love has this feature, which is that it's spiritual. So one concept is a thing that's true of the other concept, keeping in mind that we only treat it as a conceptual or definitional claim if there's some question as to what the concepts mean or the proper use of them. It's only a conceptual claim if it makes you want to go, that depends on what you mean by something. I guess you could say this one has got 3 concepts. Love is the most spiritual of emotions. Some people might say that the term emotion is sufficiently straightforward that you wouldn't need to analyze it. So you'd just be dealing with the 2 concepts, love and spiritual, which are both hard to define. Cannabis is non-addictive, so you don't need to worry about getting hooked. Okay, so this one makes you want to ask, well, that depends on what you mean by addictive. It is saying that cannabis does not have this property. So we have one concept, which is cannabis. If anybody's confused about what the word cannabis means, it means marijuana, you know, pot, weed, that sort of thing. Cannabis is actually the correct English word for that plant and that substance. Marijuana is not an English word. It comes from Mexico, and the reason why it became it's a propaganda word, and there's an interesting story to be told about how we ended up using the word marijuana when we already had a perfectly good English word instead, and remind me to tell you that story one of these days. Anyway, So it's a conceptual claim. This is a good example because it's a conceptual claim when it's claiming that something, that one concept has or does not have this characteristic, which is a second concept. So in this case, it's not claiming that it has it, it's claiming that it doesn't have it. But the concepts are cannabis and addictive, not cannabis and non-addictive. Also, cannabis is not a concept that you need to analyze. It's not unclear what that means. If you were trying to figure out if you're going to accept this claim, you would be trying to figure out what is meant by the word addictive, not the word non-addictive. So it's a conceptual claim when it's fitting one concept, when it's saying that one concept fits under the category of another concept, or when it's saying that it doesn't fit under that category. And it's a conceptual claim can also have the form of saying that one concept is true or is not true of another concept. Hope that's relatively straightforward. I'm not going to explain to you how to deal with conceptual claims and how to evaluate conceptual arguments. We're going to devote a whole class to that next time. I am just introducing them as a different kind of claim, a different kind of reasoning. The last form of inference that I'm going to be discussing in this discussion is proposal arguments. And like with conceptual arguments, we're not going to go into detail. I'm just going to introduce to you what a proposal argument is and how it differs from other kinds of arguments. Okay? Okay. So a proposal argument is basically what it sounds like. It's an argument that proposes something. A proposal argument is an argument that we should or should not do something. We should or should not do something. Here are some examples. You should get a university degree. Canada should replace first past the post voting with multiple round voting. We need tougher gun control laws. I ought not to marry my boyfriend slash girlfriend slash cousin. Why did I put in cousin? That's a reference to the whole thing about when Darwin was making a proposal argument. It was a proposal argument when he was trying to figure out whether or not he should propose to his cousin. I totally did not plan that joke. That was completely spontaneous. Please forget that I said it. Last example. The internet should not be regulated. Okay, I'm going to say a couple of things about these. Change. So a proposal argument is an argument that we should or should not do something. It's not difficult to recognize. It won't always be using the language of we should or we should not. And I tried to illustrate that with the examples. So instead of we, it could say you should or should not do something, or I should or should not do something, or something else that's specific. Canada should replace first past the post voting with multiple round voting. Another way of saying should is ought to, and that's what I used in the example. I ought not to marry my cousin. Oh, and we need tougher gun control laws is, I'm going to say, another way of saying we should enact tougher gun control laws, okay? So my point is, a proposal argument is an argument that we should or should not do something, but it can be phrased in different ways. We treat a proposal argument differently than other kinds of arguments. And I hope to illustrate that by a couple of examples. Here is a proposal argument. Premise: hybrid cars generate less greenhouse gases than regular cars. Second premise: we should reduce greenhouse gases. Conclusion: we should drive hybrid cars. Okay, so what's being argued is we should drive hybrid cars, and the reasons that you're given are hybrid cars generate less greenhouse gases, we should reduce greenhouse gases, therefore we should drive hybrid cars. Do you find this argument convincing? You can take some time to think about it if you want. Okay, write down the answer and mail it to me. Now let's consider a second example, which has a similar form. Capital punishment is more effective at deterring crime than other forms of punishment. Second premise, we should reduce crime. Okay, I was just attacked by a fly. Nobody panic. Capital punishment is more effective at deterring crime than other forms of punishment. Second premise, we should reduce crime. Therefore, we should impose capital punishment for all crimes. Now, this argument is logically very similar to the previous one, but I bet that everybody who was willing to call this argument an acceptable argument, call it a good argument, you're willing to accept this argument, say it's a good argument, maybe you're persuaded by this argument, but not this argument, even though they have more or less the same form. There's a claim that's being made, we should impose capital punishment for all crimes. It's supported by two premises. One, capital punishment is better at deterring crime, and two, we should reduce crime. Now here's the interesting part. Most people would agree with these two claims, right? We should reduce crime. Everybody thinks reducing crime is a good thing. The first premise, capital punishment is more effective at deterring crimes than other forms of punishment. That's actually debatable, but for the sake of the point that I want to make, let's not debate it right now. Let's say that we accepted both of those premises. We accepted that capital punishment, if you're confused about what that word means, capital punishment means the death penalty, execution, killing somebody as punishment for a crime. Capital punishment is better at deterring crime than other forms of punishment. Okay, we'll grant that. We should reduce crime. I think everybody agrees. Therefore, we should have capital punishment for all crimes. Wait a minute. We were willing to accept the premises, but we're not willing to accept the conclusion. What has gone wrong here? What has gone wrong here is this. Whenever we are deciding whether or not we should do something, as opposed to deciding whether or not something is true, there are always going to be multiple factors to consider. It's more straightforward to construct an argument that something is true than it is to construct an argument that we should or should not do something. This is because when it comes to what we should or shouldn't do, there's always multiple factors to consider, which brings us back to the capital punishment example. Yes, we want to deter crime, but maybe we don't want to kill shoplifters, you know? Maybe we want to reserve capital punishment for the very worst crimes. Some people think that we shouldn't have capital punishment at all, but the point is, I don't think anybody thinks that we should have capital punishment for all the crimes, you know? I don't think anybody would claim that we should execute people for pirating music off of the internet, if that's something that people still do. The thing is, there are reasons not to impose capital punishment for all crimes. And we have to consider those reasons, the reasons not to do the thing, as well as the reasons to do the thing. So that's what makes arguments that we should or should not do something, that's what makes them different from arguments that something is true. With proposal arguments, we have to go outside of what's being said in the argument to decide whether or not we're going to accept the argument or to evaluate the argument. Consider other factors. Consider factors from the opposite side, and possibly even consider other factors from the same side. So for example, if there was more than one, maybe there's more than one reason why we should drive hybrid cars, so that could also be factored into your evaluation of a proposal argument. Phew. Okay. I hope you found this useful, and I'll talk to you next week.